Imagine stepping into a hospital where every corridor whispers secrets and every room hides a story of unseen pain. Picture a place where the sterile scent of antiseptic masks a darker truth, a truth that, when uncovered, challenges everything you believed about care and compassion. This isn't just any hospital, this is Sunrise Health Center, a facility that, despite its promise of healing, harbors a harrowing secret that could shatter the very foundations of trust in modern healthcare. On what began as an ordinary day, Nurse Rachel Lewis entered the hospital with the determined resolve of someone who had seen it all, or so she thought. But as the automatic doors closed behind her, sealing off the world outside, she stepped into an environment where the familiar hum of machines and the rhythmic beeping of monitors set the stage for something far more unsettling. There was an undercurrent of tension in the air that day, a subtle shift that hinted at an impending storm of revelations. What started as a routine shift would soon escalate into a confrontation with a system riddled with neglect and discrimination. Imagine, for a moment, an elderly patient lying in a dimly lit room, his dignity eroded by the relentless march of time and the callous indifference of those entrusted with his care. His gown, stained and unkempt, served as a silent testament to the neglect that had been allowed to fester under the guise of routine procedures. His cry for help, barely audible amidst the clamor of a busy hospital, echoed with a raw intensity that pierced through the facade of clinical efficiency. And in that very moment, Nurse Rachel witnessed a reality so stark, so gut-wrenchingly unfair, that it ignited within her an unyielding determination to seek justice. In a world where every minute can mean the difference between life and death, Rachel faced a critical choice: to stand by silently or to risk everything in defense of a vulnerable life. As she documented every detail, the misplaced call button, the telltale stains, the desperate eyes of a patient betrayed by a system meant to heal, she felt the weight of responsibility press upon her. This wasn't just about following protocols, it was about confronting an injustice that cut deep into the heart of human decency. Now, I invite you to join me as we peel back the layers of this gripping story, a story that challenges the status quo, exposes uncomfortable truths about racial bias in healthcare, and showcases one nurse's brave stand against a tide of indifference. What would you do if you found yourself at the crossroads of morality and duty? How far would you go to ensure that every voice, no matter how faint, is heard and every life, no matter how fragile, is protected? Get ready to be captivated, to question what you thought you knew about compassion and justice in our healthcare system, and to follow a journey that will leave you inspired to make a difference. Rachel Lewis stepped through the glass doors of Sunrise Health Center, immediately engulfed by the clean, clinical scent of antiseptic and the humming energy of a hospital in full swing. Every day, as a temporary nurse, she braced herself for the controlled chaos that awaited inside. Even though she had grown accustomed to the constant bustle, her heart still fluttered with a mix of nerves and determination at the start of every shift. The automatic doors slid shut behind her, sealing off the outside world and ushering her into an environment where every step carried the weight of responsibility. Inside the corridor, the fluorescent lights flickered over sterile floors and polished surfaces. Rachel's footsteps echoed softly as she made her way to the locker room to change into her scrubs. Nursing had always been her calling, a passion born from a desire to care for others in their most vulnerable moments. Yet, as a temp, she often felt like an outsider, forced to prove herself over and over in a labyrinth of bustling corridors. Doctors in crisp white coats dashed by with resolute expressions, while nurses maneuvered medication carts with a purpose that belied the underlying urgency in every movement. The incessant beeping of monitors composed an uneasy symphony, a constant reminder of the lives teetering on the brink. After a brief moment to collect herself, Rachel set off on her rounds. Today, something felt different in the air, a strange, almost electric tension that hinted at an unfolding crisis. Dismissing it as the natural jitters of a new shift, she proceeded down the quiet hallway. However, as she neared the patient rooms, a soft, labored sound reached her ears, a stifled sob that seemed to vibrate with unbearable weight. Drawn toward the sound, Rachel's steps quickened until she reached the door of room 237. There, behind a closed door, the atmosphere felt ominously silent. With a deep breath to steady herself, she gently pushed the door open. The scene that unfolded before her stole the very breath from her lungs. In the dim light of the room lay Mr. Leonard Johnson, an elderly man with skin as rich and dark as polished ebony, slumped against his hospital bed. His frail body was barely shielded by a stained hospital gown, and each shuddering gasp for air betrayed a deep-seated pain. His thin, trembling frame was accentuated by the signs of neglect that screamed from every corner of the room. A tipped-over bottle of urine lay on the floor, its contents seeping into the fabric of the linen and mixing with the acrid tang of antiseptic, forming a nauseating blend that clashed violently with the clinical surroundings. Most jarring of all was the yellow stain on his gown, a clear, damning sign that it had not been changed in far too long. The call button, frustratingly positioned just out of reach, mocked his helpless state. Rachel's training and compassion surged forward instinctively. She rushed to Mr. Johnson's side, her hands steady even as her mind raced. The patient's skin was clammy to the touch, and when his eyes met hers, they flickered with a mix of relief and a lingering, haunting fear. "Thank God," he croaked, his voice breaking as if choked by sorrow. "I thought I'd been forgotten." His words, punctuated by tears, echoed with the agony of a man abandoned in his moment of need. As Rachel carefully assessed his condition, she began to catalogue the many signs of neglect, the dehydration evident in his dry lips, the potential for bed sores on his frail skin, and the unmistakable markers of malnutrition. Each revelation struck her like a physical blow. "How long have you been left like this?" she asked gently, her voice betraying a hint of disbelief mixed with sorrow. Mr. Johnson's eyes welled with fresh tears as he rasped, "It's been days. I tried telling them, I tried explaining I was in pain, that something was terribly wrong. But every time, Dr. Oliver Reed just looked at me like I was making it all up. I may be old, but I'm not blind, I know when I'm being ignored." Those words hit Rachel with the force of a thunderclap. As she listened, the implications of his accusation reverberated in her mind. Could it be that racial bias was influencing patient care right here, in the very halls of Sunrise Health Center? The thought was both shocking and deeply personal. Looking into Mr. Johnson's eyes, she saw not just pain, but a silent plea for someone to stand up and fight for him. In that moment, a fierce determination ignited within her, a determination to challenge a system that allowed such neglect to fester. Yet even as resolve took root, the reality of the situation pressed heavily upon her. Speaking up against a respected physician like Dr. Reed, especially as a temporary nurse, was a risk that could endanger not only her job but her very future in nursing. Still, the moral imperative to protect a vulnerable patient outweighed her fear. With a steadying breath, Rachel gently adjusted Mr. Johnson's pillows and reached for her clipboard, her thoughts swirling with the potential consequences of her actions. The memory of a professor's words echoed in her mind, "We nurses are often the last line of defense. Our silence can be as damaging as any mistake." In that moment, the risks were crystal clear. The potential fallout from challenging a long-established protocol was immense, but the sight of Mr. Johnson, his body frail, his dignity compromised, left her no choice. With deliberate precision, Rachel began to document every detail of his condition. She wrote down the physical signs of neglect, the misplaced call button, and the yellow stains that should never have marred his gown. Each note was a silent vow to uphold the ethics that had drawn her to nursing in the first place. Clutching her clipboard like a shield, Rachel stepped out of the patient's room with a heavy heart and a steely resolve. The storm that was about to break was already gathering momentum, and she knew that her next step would be the most challenging yet. Determined to confront the issue head-on, she made her way down the corridor toward Dr. Oliver Reed's office, a space known for its austere decor and cold authority. With every step, the din of the hospital seemed to fade into the background, replaced by the rapid beating of her own pulse. Arriving at the door of Dr. Reed's office, Rachel hesitated only for a split second before knocking. "Come in," came the curt command from within. Stepping inside, her gaze fell upon Dr. Reed, who sat behind a large, imposing desk. His posture was rigid, and his eyes, cold and calculating, locked onto hers. The air in the room was thick with tension, as if every word exchanged could be cut with a scalpel. "Dr. Reed," Rachel began, her voice steadier than she felt, "I need to discuss Mr. Johnson's care with you." Dr. Reed's eyebrow arched slightly, his tone laced with condescension. "Mr. Johnson? What about him?" he asked, dismissing her concern with a wave of his hand as if the matter were trivial. Taking a deep breath to quell the rising anger within her, Rachel pressed on. "I've documented several instances of neglect in his care. His gown is soiled, his call button is out of reach, and he's been complaining of severe pain that has gone unaddressed." Dr. Reed's eyes narrowed, and his expression hardened. "Nurse Lewis, are you suggesting that our protocols here are inadequate?" he asked in a low, dangerous tone. Before Rachel could respond, Mr. Johnson's earlier words echoed in her mind, his lament about being dismissed simply because of the color of his skin. Summoning every ounce of courage, she stated firmly, "Mr. Johnson feels that his concerns are being dismissed because of his race. I cannot ignore that possibility." A silence fell over the room, charged and heavy with implications. Dr. Reed slowly rose from behind his desk, his gaze piercing. "Are you accusing me of racial bias, Nurse Lewis?" he demanded, his voice low and threatening. Rachel's hands trembled slightly, but her resolve did not falter. "I'm reporting what I've observed and what the patient has expressed. It's our duty to investigate any potential issues in patient care, regardless of who is involved." At that moment, footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. Curious glances from other staff filtered in through the open door, turning the private confrontation into an unintended spectacle. Dr. Reed's eyes flicked to the doorway, and his voice dropped to a harsh whisper. "Listen carefully, Nurse Lewis. Accusations like this can ruin careers. If you pursue this matter, I can guarantee that your time at Sunrise Health Center will be very short." The threat hung in the air like a dark cloud, and for a moment, Rachel's confidence wavered. The potential consequences, being labeled a troublemaker, losing her job, and perhaps even sacrificing her career, raced through her mind. Yet as she looked back at the resolute face of Mr. Johnson in her memory, her inner voice spoke louder than her fear. With a deep, steadying breath, she declared, "Dr. Reed, I will be taking this to the hospital administration immediately." Her words seemed to echo off the sterile walls, and as she turned to leave, Dr. Reed remained seated, his expression inscrutable and his eyes burning with a mix of anger and disbelief. Outside, the murmurs of discontent among the staff followed her, and the heavy burden of what she had set in motion pressed down on her shoulders. With the confrontation behind her, Rachel hurried back to Mr. Johnson's room. The corridor, once bustling with energy, now felt eerily quiet, as though the entire hospital held its breath in anticipation of what would come next. When she reached the door, an unsettling silence greeted her, broken only by the intermittent beeping of monitors. Pushing the door open, she froze. Mr. Johnson lay motionless on the bed, his skin ashen and clammy. The monitor's urgent beeping matched the rising panic in her chest. "Mr. Johnson, can you hear me?" Rachel called out, her voice quavering as she knelt beside him. There was no response. His breathing was shallow, and his pulse, once faint but steady, had grown dangerously weak. In that frantic moment, her mind raced through possible complications, dehydration, infection, even organ failure, and the grim reality of each possibility tightened its grip on her heart. Without hesitation, Rachel pressed the call button repeatedly. "I need help in here," she shouted down the hallway, her voice echoing with urgency. Within moments, additional nurses and a resident rushed into the room. As they worked quickly to stabilize Mr. Johnson, adjusting his oxygen, checking his 4 lines, and administering critical care, Rachel stood back, her eyes filling with a mixture of hope and sorrow. She recalled the statistics she had read about delayed care, increased mortality, longer hospital stays, and preventable complications. Now, these grim facts had taken on a human face in the frail form of Mr. Johnson. After what felt like an eternity, the crisis began to subside. Mr. Johnson's vital signs improved, inching their way back to normal. Rachel exhaled deeply, a mixture of relief and deep-seated worry flooding her senses. Yet even as the immediate danger passed, a new urgency settled over her, a realization that this incident was emblematic of a systemic failure that endangered countless vulnerable patients. With a final, lingering glance at Mr. Johnson, now resting more comfortably, Rachel steeled herself for the next step. It was time to expose the hidden flaws in a system that allowed such neglect to flourish. Determined, she strode purposefully toward the administrative office. Each step was weighted with the memories of Mr. Johnson's pain and the chilling threats from Dr. Reed. The sterile, quiet atmosphere of the administrative hall stood in stark contrast to the storm raging in her heart. When she finally reached the receptionist's desk, she paused only briefly before dialing the number that would set the wheels of accountability in motion. Her voice, though slightly trembling, carried the weight of conviction as she introduced herself. "This is Nurse Rachel Lewis. I need to report a serious case of patient neglect and possible discrimination." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. There was a pause on the other end, and then the administrator's measured tone cut through the silence. "That is a very serious allegation, Nurse Lewis. Do you have evidence to support your claim?" Rachel's grip on the phone tightened. "Yes, I have detailed documentation of Mr. Johnson's condition, including time-stamped notes, photographs, and even his own recorded statement regarding his treatment by Dr. Reed." Her voice grew firmer, bolstered by the knowledge that truth was on her side. "I attempted to discuss these concerns directly with Dr. Reed, but he dismissed me and implied that pursuing this matter could jeopardize my position." For a long moment, silence stretched on the line. Then, in a tone that was carefully neutral, the administrator responded, "I'll need to see all of your evidence immediately." A flicker of relief passed over Rachel's face, though it was quickly tempered by a new wave of anxiety. "I can bring everything to your office right away," she replied. Gathering her meticulously prepared notes, photographs, and other documentation, Rachel made her way to the administrator's office. Inside, the gravity of the situation seemed to manifest in every detail of the room. The administrator's eyes widened as he flipped through her records, his brow furrowing with every new piece of evidence he encountered. "This is deeply concerning," he finally said, his tone mixing disbelief with a grudging respect. "I will launch a full investigation immediately." As Rachel left the administrator's office, the weight of her actions pressed heavily upon her. Whispers trailed behind her down the corridors, some expressions of admiration, others laced with skepticism and fear. "Who does she think she is?" one voice hissed, while another murmured, "We'll all be under scrutiny now." The charged atmosphere was palpable, and every step Rachel took was marked by the knowledge that she had set in motion a chain of events that would rock the very foundation of Sunrise Health Center. Throughout the day, the hospital's atmosphere transformed. The once familiar corridors now thrummed with an undercurrent of tension and anticipation. Even as Rachel continued her duties, her mind repeatedly returned to Mr. Johnson, the suffering patient who had become the symbol of a broken system. Her heart pounded as she moved from room to room, half expecting someone to confront her about the allegations. Yet, instead of open hostility, she encountered an eerie silence punctuated only by the rhythmic beeping of monitors and the occasional squeak of shoes on the polished floor. In a quiet corner of the medication room, a fellow nurse caught Rachel's eye and offered a small, encouraging smile. Later, an orderly named Tyler leaned in and whispered, "You did the right thing." These small gestures of support were like lifelines amid the sea of uncertainty, yet they did little to alleviate the underlying fear of retribution. Some colleagues' eyes were filled with hope, others, with resentment and apprehension. The hospital staff seemed to be divided, their unspoken judgments hanging in the air. As dusk approached and Rachel finally clocked out, she felt a mix of physical exhaustion and emotional turmoil. Stepping out onto the hospital grounds, she was confronted with a scene that mirrored the growing unrest within Sunrise Health Center. A large crowd had gathered, a sea of faces representing patients' families, community activists, and concerned citizens. Colorful signs waved in the air, demanding justice and change. Chants of "No more bias" and "Equal care for all" reverberated against the brick facade of the building, a stark counterpoint to the sterile quiet of the corridors inside. In the ensuing days, the media caught wind of the controversy. Rachel's phone buzzed incessantly with interview requests and messages of support. Local newspapers splashed front-page headlines detailing the discrimination and neglect that Mr. Johnson had suffered. Each article fanned the flames of public outrage, and it wasn't long before the hospital's administration found itself backed into a corner. Emergency board meetings were held deep into the night as executives scrambled to manage the fallout. During one of her shifts, Rachel overheard whispers about a major announcement from the board. The atmosphere in the hallways was electric with anticipation and uncertainty. New posters began appearing around the hospital, proclaiming messages like, "Patient rights are human rights" and "Speak up against discrimination." One poster boldly asked, "Have you witnessed neglect? Speak out." A shiver of apprehension ran down her spine at the thought of how far her single act of courage had reached. In the break room, Dr. Raymond Pierce, the head of internal medicine, cornered Rachel. His usually stern face was etched with concern as he spoke in a low, urgent tone. "Nurse Lewis, the board is in an uproar. Some want to sweep this under the rug, while others are pushing for a complete overhaul of our policies." His words hung heavy in the air, and Rachel felt the enormity of her decision press upon her once again. The idea of stirring up such controversy had been daunting, yet now it seemed that change was inevitable. As the day drew to a close, an announcement echoed over the hospital intercom: all staff were to report to the auditorium at 5 p.m. for an important meeting. The corridors buzzed with nervous energy as employees gathered, their expressions a mix of hope, fear, and uncertainty. Rachel took her seat among them, her pulse quickening with every passing second. Every pair of eyes in the room seemed fixed upon her, some shining with admiration and others dark with suspicion. Finally, the hospital administrator, Mr. Franklin Adams, stepped up to the podium. His face was grave as he addressed the assembled staff. "As you all know, serious allegations have been made regarding patient care here at Sunrise Health Center. I regret to inform you that, effective immediately, Dr. Oliver Reed has been suspended pending further investigation." A collective gasp swept through the room. For a moment, time seemed to stand still as relief and shock mingled in the air. Then Mr. Adams continued, "Furthermore, we are implementing mandatory bias training for all staff and forming a patient advocacy committee to address concerns of discrimination and neglect." The meeting adjourned amid a flurry of hushed conversations and tentative expressions of hope. Rachel felt a complex mix of emotions, a deep sense of vindication, tempered by anxiety about what the future might hold. As she left the auditorium, the weight of the stares from her colleagues pressed down on her, each gaze a silent commentary on the risks she had taken. In that moment, she couldn't help but wonder what storms still lay ahead in the relentless fight for true equality in healthcare. That night, as she made her way back through the now quiet corridors of Sunrise Health Center, the enormity of her actions settled in. The once familiar building had transformed before her eyes into a battleground for justice and reform. Every step she took was accompanied by memories of Mr. Johnson's suffering, the cold threat in Dr. Reed's voice, and the unwavering determination that had driven her to stand up for what was right, even at the cost of her own career. In the solitude of her small apartment later that evening, Rachel replayed the day's events in her mind. The image of Mr. Johnson's frail, neglected form was seared into her memory, a constant reminder of why she had chosen this path. She thought of the accolades from a few supportive colleagues and the whispered threats from others, realizing that her act of courage had cracked open a facade built on complacency and bias. Though the future was uncertain, she felt an inner strength that she had never known before, a resolute determination to see justice done, regardless of the personal cost. Then, as if to test her resolve further, her phone buzzed. The call was from Dr. Everett Collins, a member of the hospital board. "Nurse Lewis, this is Dr. Collins," he said warmly. "I want to commend you for your bravery in coming forward. Your actions have sparked a much-needed change at Sunrise Health Center." His words brought tears to her eyes, tears of relief, pride, and a cautious hope that maybe, just maybe, things would be different from now on. Over the following weeks, as the investigation into Dr. Reed's conduct unfolded and sweeping changes began to ripple through the hospital, Rachel found herself caught in a whirlwind of media attention and internal politics. Every day, she was reminded of the fragility of the system she had once trusted so implicitly. The hospital that had once felt like a beacon of hope now seemed fraught with shadows of doubt and the heavy burden of accountability. Yet, amidst the turmoil, a quiet transformation was taking place, one that promised to redefine patient care and restore dignity to those who had long been neglected. The legacy of that fateful day extended far beyond the immediate crisis. Rachel's unwavering commitment to her patient had ignited a movement among her colleagues and the community at large. Meetings were held, committees were formed, and policies were rewritten in an effort to ensure that no patient would ever be treated as less than human again. As the reforms took shape, the once divided staff began to find common ground in their shared desire for a system that prioritized compassion and fairness over convenience and prejudice. Yet, the road ahead was not without its challenges. Rumors circulated about potential legal action, and the specter of professional retribution loomed large over Rachel's future. Every day, as she donned her scrubs and walked the corridors of Sunrise Health Center, she felt the weight of countless eyes upon her, some admiring, others envious, and still others fearful of the change she represented. The tension was palpable, a constant reminder that courage often came at a steep price. In quiet moments during her shifts, Rachel would find herself reflecting on the choices that had brought her to this crossroads. She recalled the early days of her training, the excitement of beginning a career dedicated to healing, and the gradual realization that sometimes, the cost of silence was far greater than the risk of speaking out. Every time she thought of Mr. Johnson, of his whispered pleas and the silent agony etched on his face, a renewed sense of purpose surged within her. This was not merely about one patient, it was about a systemic failure that endangered countless lives, a failure that she had dared to confront head-on. As the investigation deepened and changes began to materialize, the media storm intensified. News crews camped outside the hospital, and social media buzzed with heated debates over the issues of patient neglect and racial bias in healthcare. Headlines flashed across television screens, and opinion pieces in local newspapers cast a spotlight on the need for accountability and reform. Amidst the public outcry, Rachel remained resolute, knowing that her actions had sparked a conversation that was too important to ignore. The transformation at Sunrise Health Center was gradual but undeniable. New protocols were implemented, and staff training sessions on cultural sensitivity and patient rights became a regular part of the hospital's routine. The formation of a patient advocacy committee served as a constant reminder that every voice mattered, that every patient, regardless of background or circumstance, deserved the highest standard of care. For Rachel, the long, arduous journey from temporary nurse to an agent of change had only just begun. One crisp morning, as she walked into the hospital with a quiet confidence that belied the storms she had weathered, Rachel caught sight of a familiar figure in the hallway. It was a young delivery driver named Jamal Rivera, whose concern for his elderly neighbor had recently rallied an entire community in support of better care. Their eyes met for a brief moment, a silent acknowledgement of the shared fight against injustice. That moment, though fleeting, filled her with hope for a future where every act of courage, no matter how small, could spark monumental change. As the weeks turned into months, Rachel's journey became a symbol of resilience and unwavering integrity. Her name, once just another among the many nurses at Sunrise Health Center, came to represent the relentless pursuit of justice and the belief that every patient deserved respect and dignity. Though the challenges were far from over, she embraced each day with a renewed sense of purpose, determined to leave a legacy defined not by fear, but by compassion and integrity. Now, as the echoes of that tumultuous day continued to ripple through the corridors of Sunrise Health Center, the battle for true equality in healthcare was far from over. Yet, in every whispered conversation, every determined glance, and every act of solidarity, there remained an unspoken promise, a promise that no patient would ever be left behind, and no act of injustice would go unchallenged. Before we wrap up, I want to say thank you for staying with me through this powerful and emotional journey. Your support means everything, and I hope this story inspires you to always stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult. If you found this story as moving and thought-provoking as I did, please hit that subscribe button and leave a comment with your thoughts. What would you do if you were in Nurse Rachel Lewis's shoes? Let's keep this conversation going and share our experiences, because together, we can demand a world where compassion and justice always come first. Stay inspired, stay informed, and never be afraid to stand up for what's right.